Hello psychology students, Professor Zeeb here. Welcome to our short lecture on first impressions as a part of our social psychology chapter. So what we're going to do in this short presentation is just sort of cover first impressions, what we know about them, and some studies that seem to be connected to first impressions. So we will start off by this photograph here. When you're looking at this person, let's say you met this person at a party or something, what would be your first impression of them? I think a lot of us would have some pretty strong responses here, but in case you did not know, this is the very famous surrealist artist Salvador Dali. But of course, if you did not know that, I think a lot of us would form an impression that this person may be kind of strange and different in some way. In other words, we have discovered in psychology that first impressions seem to be very powerful stuff, and they are definitely for real. So we're going to look at some different studies and facts about first impressions. One of the reasons we think first impressions are so powerful has to do with this effect in psychology known as the primacy effect. This was covered in earlier chapters, specifically our memory chapter, but if you remember, what it's basically saying is that first impression influences us more than, say, later information, or at least can. In other words, what we're exposed to in the beginning seems to matter in terms of our thinking or even our perception of others in this particular case, and so we know that this is powerful stuff. So we're going to look at a study here that kind of demonstrates this. Let's say you're in a study, and by the way, this comes from Russo, Carlson, and Malloy back in 2006, where they exposed subjects to different restaurant reviews. In other words, they gave them a description of a couple different restaurants, and of course, those restaurant reviews were completely rigged and fictitious, but of course the subjects did not know that. In some cases, the restaurant reviews were very glowing. So in other words, this is a great restaurant, excellent food, great service, you have to eat here. And then some of the other reviews, as you can imagine, were not so glowing. Bad food, bad service, please don't go to this restaurant. So in other words, all of these subjects were exposed to both reviews and they were randomly mixed up. And then they asked the person, would you be willing to visit this restaurant? So keep in mind, supposedly they were describing the same restaurant and they were arranged in those two categories. Well, as you can imagine, where we're going with this basically is that whichever review the subject was exposed to first, and keep in mind they did read both of them, seemed to be the critical factor in terms of if they would visit that restaurant. So for example, if they read the good review first, then they said, yes, I would be more likely to visit this restaurant. But of course, if they read the poor review, then they often would say that no, I would probably not go. Remember, they read both reviews, so it seems that the first one seems to be pretty critical in terms of if they would visit the restaurant. So basically what that's showing is that a lot of times we're influenced by first information that we are exposed to. Excuse me. So we've discovered that first impressions can be formed extremely quickly. And even in some cases, we're talking less than a second. So we know that we quickly form these impressions of people, just based on looking at someone very, very quickly. However, as you can imagine, they don't always hold up. So even though we may form a quick opinion about someone by looking at them quickly, we later find that they may not actually match up to what is actually happening in reality. So in other words, even though sometimes they do correlate with future experiences, sometimes they don't. But either way, we know that we do form these impressions very, very quickly. We've also discovered that first impressions can become what we call a self-fulfilling prophecy. So this one is very psychological here. What this basically means is that these are expectations that change our own behavior in such a way as to increase the probability of the predicted event. In other words, if you think something is going to happen it may influence your thoughts and your behavior to such an extent that it actually does come true. So a lot of us can kind of relate to this in our own life, where you go into a situation with a positive mind frame, you would probably have a better experience than, say, having a negative mind frame. So we're going to look at a study that sort of demonstrates this concept in relation to first impressions. This was a study done by Snyder, Tenke, and Burchid back in 1977. And they told the subjects that were doing an experiment on human interaction over the telephone, and we want you to call this particular person, and then they would then show a photograph of that person just prior to the phone call. In other words, the photograph is serving as the first impression. In some cases, the photograph was of a very attractive person. What they found is that the subject, based on their impression of this photograph, in other words, they seem attractive, probably nice, I would probably like this person, they found that they were overly nice and cordial in that conversation. Theoretically, what we're saying is that based on that impression of the photograph, they sort of thought about this person in a positive way, and they started treating them that way on the phone. Well, what do you know? The person on the other end of the other end of the conversation, which was another subject, by the way, started feeding off that behavior and started acting nice in return. So in other words, the point is that if my impression of this person is extremely positive, I may sort of act nicer than I normally would, which of course rubs off on that other person where they start acting nice in return. Let's look at it this way. Let's say you were handed a photograph of this person, and we want you to call this person. So in other words, you could agree that this person does not seem very attractive in what our society says you should be. They notice that the subjects in this particular case, and by the way, these are fictitious photographs. These weren't the actual photographs in the study, but as a demonstration, they noticed that the subjects started acting a little bit cold and distant towards that other person based on this first impression of the photograph. So in other words, in looking at this person, I may feel that they're kind of strange, maybe not so nice, whatever the case may be. It got to the point where it affected how they treated that other subject on the phone. Remember, not actually the person in the photograph. And the subject on the other end of the phone started acting that way in return. So if I'm being cold and kind of negative towards that person, they're probably going to feed off that and act that way in return. So thus, I have fulfilled my own prophecy. So you can kind of see the connection here is that sometimes we form these impressions of people, could be based just on viewing that person in a couple seconds. It may start getting us to think in a certain direction or even change our behavior in such a way to make those impressions more likely to come true because people are going to feed off how they are treated. So anyway, it's just basically showing that there's a lot of research surrounding first impressions, and whether or not they hold up, we know that they can be very powerful influences in how we perceive and think about other people. So this will conclude our short lecture on first impressions, and if you would please go on to the next step in the class.